My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm 32 years old, and I used to believe that family meant everything. Standing in my empty apartment now, boxes scattered around what used to be my brother's home, I can barely recognize the woman who once bent over backward to keep everyone happy. If you're watching this story unfold, please hit that like button and subscribe because this journey of reclaiming my voice needs to be heard. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday. I was making my usual coffee in my small kitchen, humming along to the radio, when my phone buzzed with a text from my sister-in-law Jennifer. "We need to talk. Today." No pleasantries, no explanation. Just that cold, clinical demand that had become her signature over the past 3 years since she married my younger brother Marcus. I should have known something was brewing. The family dinners had become increasingly tense, with Jennifer's pursed lips and meaningful glances whenever I spoke too enthusiastically about my work as a music teacher, or when I laughed too loudly at Dad's terrible jokes, or when I dared to have an opinion that differed from her carefully curated worldview. Marcus, my baby brother who I'd practically raised after Mom died when he was 12, had slowly transformed from my closest confidant into Jennifer's silent shadow. The apartment I'm standing in now, the one they lived in rent-free for 2 years, it's mine. I bought it with my inheritance from Mom, intending it as an investment property. But when Marcus and Jennifer got married and needed a place to start their life together, I handed over the keys without hesitation. Family first, I told myself. Blood is thicker than water. How naive I was. I remember arriving at the apartment that Tuesday afternoon, my heart already racing because Jennifer's tone had carried that particular edge that meant confrontation was coming. She answered the door in her perfectly pressed blouse and pencil skirt, her blonde hair pulled back in that severe bun that made her look older than her 28 years. Behind her, I could see Marcus hovering in the hallway, his shoulders already slumped in defeat. "Rebecca," she said, not inviting me in, "we need to discuss your behavior." My behavior. As if I were a child being called to the principal's office. I felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks, but I pushed it down. "What about my behavior, Jennifer?" She stepped back, finally allowing me into what was technically my own property. The apartment looked different somehow, colder, more sterile than I remembered. Gone were the warm throw pillows I'd left behind, replaced with Jennifer's minimalist aesthetic. Even the walls seemed to have lost their personality under her influence. "You're too loud, Rebecca. Too much." She said the word much like it left a bitter taste in her mouth. "My family has been very patient, but they've expressed concerns about your presence at family gatherings. Your voice carries, you interrupt conversations, and you make people uncomfortable with your enthusiasm." The words hit me like physical blows. Too loud, too much, uncomfortable. These were criticisms I'd heard whispered behind my back my entire life, but never so directly, never so cruelly. I glanced at Marcos, hoping for some sign of support, some indication that he disagreed with his wife's assessment. Instead, he studied his shoes like they held the secrets of the universe. "Marcus," I said, my voice smaller than I'd intended. "Do you feel this way too?" He finally looked up and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Shame mixed with resignation. "Becca, you know I love you, but—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence that would completely shatter my world. But Jennifer had no such qualms. "We think it would be best if you took a step back from family events. Give everyone some space to breathe." She crossed her arms, and I noticed for the first time how she positioned herself between Marcus and me, like a barrier, like a guard protecting something precious from contamination. Standing there in my own apartment, being told I was too much for my own family, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not break, not yet, but develop a hairline fracture that would eventually split me wide open. I nodded mutely, mumbled something about understanding, and left without another word. That night, lying in my bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that the woman who had walked out of that apartment was not the same woman who had walked in. Something fundamental had shifted, and there was no going back. The foundation of dysfunction. To understand how I became the family scapegoat, you need to know about the Martinez family dynamics that were established long before Jennifer ever entered the picture. We were never what you'd call a functional family, but we were tight-knit in the way that trauma bonds people together. My father, Roberto Martinez, was a good man crushed by circumstances. When my mother, Elena, died of breast cancer 10 years ago, he didn't just lose his wife, he lost his anchor, his translator between the emotional needs of his children and his own inability to express feelings. Dad had immigrated from Mexico in his 20s, built a successful construction business through sheer determination and back-breaking work, but emotional intelligence wasn't part of his toolkit. After Mom's death, I naturally stepped into the maternal role. At 22, I was barely an adult myself, but Marcus was only 12 and falling apart. Dad worked longer hours, buried himself in projects, and left the emotional heavy lifting to me. I made sure Marcus did his homework, attended his school events, taught him to shave, had the awkward conversations about girls and growing up. I became his mother, his sister, and his best friend, all rolled into one. The pattern was established early. I was the loud one, the emotional one, the one who felt everything intensely and expressed it freely. In our grief-stricken household, my natural exuberance stood out like a neon sign in a cemetery. Dad would wince when I laughed too hard. Marcus would roll his eyes when I got excited about small victories. And gradually I learned that my authentic self was somehow wrong. But I was also indispensable. When Marcus had nightmares, he came to me. When Dad needed someone to translate his feelings into words for parent-teacher conferences, he relied on me. When family gatherings needed organizing, when holidays required someone to inject life into our mourning household, when someone needed to be the emotional labor force that kept us functioning, that someone was always me. I threw myself into this role with the desperate energy of someone trying to fill an unfillable void. I became the family cheerleader, the problem solver, the one who made sure everyone else was okay. Even when I was drowning in my own unprocessed grief, my personality became bigger, louder, more intense because I was trying to generate enough emotional energy for 3 people. Marcus thrived under my care. He graduated high school with honors, got into college, started his career in accounting. Dad's business continued to grow, partly because I helped him with the books, partly because I made sure he ate regular meals and didn't completely retreat into work-induced isolation. I was the success story of our little family, the one who held everything together. But success came at a cost. I never learned how to exist at a normal volume because normal had never been an option. I developed an almost pathological need to make sure everyone around me was happy, comfortable, taken care of. I became hypervigilant about other people's emotions while completely ignoring my own. I was so busy being what everyone needed that I forgot to figure out who I actually was. When Marcus started dating Jennifer during his final year of college, I was genuinely excited. My baby brother was in love. He seemed happier, more confident, and I was ready to welcome another woman into our small family with open arms. I planned elaborate dinners when she visited, bought thoughtful gifts for her birthday, included her in every family tradition. Jennifer, however, seemed to view my enthusiasm as an invasion rather than an invitation. She was quiet where I was loud, reserved where I was open, controlled where I was spontaneous. She came from a family where emotions were compartmentalized, where conversations happened in measured tones, where spontaneous laughter was considered unseemly. I should have recognized the signs earlier. The way she would purse her lips when I got excited about something. The way she'd exchange glances with Marcus when I told a story with my usual animated gestures. The way she'd redirect conversations away from topics that sparked my passion. She wasn't just uncomfortable with my personality, she was actively working to diminish it. But I was so conditioned to accommodate others that I interpreted her discomfort as my failure. I started monitoring my voice volume, censoring my stories, dimming my natural light to make room for her to shine. Marcus seemed to approve of these changes, which only reinforced my belief that my authentic self was somehow defective. The engagement was a beautiful affair. I helped plan every detail, from the venue to the flowers to the menu. I gave a heartfelt maid of honor speech about how happy I was to gain a sister. I meant every word, even as I noticed how Jennifer's smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. The wedding was even more elaborate. I organized the rehearsal dinner, handled last-minute crisis management, made sure every detail was perfect. I danced at the reception, laughed with relatives, celebrated my brother's happiness with the kind of joy that bubbled up from my core. I thought I had successfully navigated the transition from being Marcus's primary emotional support to sharing that role with his new wife. I was wrong. What I interpreted as successful integration, Jennifer saw as continued interference. What I thought was appropriate sisterly involvement, she experienced as boundary violations. What I believed was love, she perceived as control. The apartment offer came from a place of genuine generosity. They were struggling with rent, I had the resources to help, and family takes care of family. It seemed like a perfect solution that would give them a financial head start while providing me with reliable tenants I could trust. Looking back now, I can see how that apartment became both a symbol of my love and a weapon for my destruction. It represented everything that was complicated about our family dynamic. My need to provide, their willingness to accept, and the unspoken power imbalances that would eventually tear us apart. But at the time, all I saw was an opportunity to help the people I loved most in the world. I had no idea I was also handing over the keys to my own emotional prison, the slow erosion of self. The changes didn't happen overnight. Jennifer was far too smart for that. Instead, she employed a strategy so subtle, so gradual, that I didn't recognize the systematic dismantling of my place in the family until it was nearly complete. She was like water wearing a waystone, persistent, patient, and devastatingly effective. It started with small suggestions that seemed reasonable on the surface. "Maybe we could have a quieter dinner tonight," she'd say when I was excited about sharing news from my job. "I have a headache, and loud sounds just really get to me." Who argues with someone who has a headache? I learned to modulate my voice, to contain my enthusiasm, to save my stories for later. Later never came. The family dinners that had once been weekly became monthly, then sporadic. Jennifer was always busy. Work commitments, social obligations with her family, couples activities that didn't include extended family. Marcus, eager to please his new wife, went along with every scheduling conflict, every polite decline, every gradual withdrawal from the traditions that had sustained us for years. "We're building our own traditions now," he explained when I asked why they'd missed Dad's birthday dinner. "Jennifer's family does things differently, and we're trying to find a balance." Balance. That word became a recurring theme in our conversations. Everything needed to be balanced. Their time between families, their energy between obligations, their loyalty between old relationships and new ones. Somehow, in this quest for balance, I always ended up being the weight that tipped the scale too far in one direction. My relationship with Marcos began to change in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Phone calls became shorter, less frequent. Our easy banter was replaced by careful conversations where I felt like I was walking through a minefield. He started fact-checking my stories, correcting details that didn't really matter, questioning my memory of shared experiences. "Are you sure it happened that way, Becca?" he'd ask when I'd tell a funny story about our childhood. I remember it differently. This from the brother who used to build elaborate fantasy worlds with me, who trusted me to remember our mother's voice when his own memory began to fade. Jennifer's family became increasingly present in their lives. The Whitmans were everything we weren't: quiet, reserved, financially established, emotionally restrained. Jennifer's mother, Patricia, spoke in the kind of hushed tones usually reserved for libraries and funeral homes. Her father, Richard, communicated primarily through meaningful nods and the occasional dry observation. Their dinner conversations revolved around stock market performance, property values, and the kind of cultural events that required advance reservations and business casual attire. I met them exactly 3 times in 2 years. Each encounter left me feeling like I'd failed some invisible test I hadn't known I was taking. They were polite, certainly, but with the kind of politeness that maintains distance rather than builds connection. They asked about my job teaching music to elementary school children with the same tone they might use to inquire about someone's unfortunate medical condition. "How rewarding," Patricia said when I enthusiastically described a recent school concert where my students had performed pieces they'd composed themselves. The pause before rewarding spoke volumes about what she really thought of my career choice. Meanwhile, Jennifer began subtly repositioning herself as Marcus's primary advisor and confidant. When he got a promotion at work, I heard about it through a casual mention rather than the excited phone call I would have received in the past. When they were considering buying a car, Jennifer handled all the research and negotiations, tasks that Marcos and I used to tackle together, armed with spreadsheets and consumer reports and way too much enthusiasm for comparison shopping. The apartment arrangement became increasingly uncomfortable. I'd initially hoped that living in my property would create more opportunities for casual interaction, but instead, it became a source of awkward tension. I felt like I needed permission to visit my own investment, while they seemed to view any contact as an intrusion on their privacy. When the water heater broke, they called a repair service rather than letting me know about the problem. When they wanted to paint the bedroom, they went ahead without asking, choosing colors that clashed with the hardwood floors I'd carefully selected. Small things, petty things, but each incident reinforced the growing distance between us. I started to feel like I was watching my own family from outside a window, seeing them carry on with their lives while I remained locked out in the cold. The exclusion wasn't dramatic enough to confront directly, but it was pervasive enough to slowly erode my sense of belonging. The final straw should have been the Christmas incident. I'd spent weeks planning our traditional celebration, the menu, the decorations, the gift exchange. 3 days before Christmas, Marcus called to let me know they'd be spending the holiday with the Whitmans instead. "Jennifer's grandmother is getting older," he explained, "and this might be her last Christmas. You understand, right?" I understood. I understood that I was no longer a priority. I understood that our family traditions were disposable. I understood that my feelings were less important than maintaining peace in his marriage. But I also understood that challenging this decision would make me the difficult one, the unreasonable one, the sister who couldn't accept that things change when people get married. So I spent Christmas Day alone with Dad, both of us pretending that the empty chairs at our dining room table didn't represent a fundamental shift in our family structure. We ate too much food, watched football games we didn't really care about, and avoided talking about the obvious absence of the people who should have been there. That night, Dad said something that haunts me still. "Your mother would have known how to handle this." It wasn't an accusation, just a sad observation from a man who missed his wife and was watching his family scatter to the winds. But I heard it as confirmation of my failure to hold us together, failure to make everyone happy, failure to be enough. I threw myself even harder into being the accommodating sister, the understanding daughter, the family member who never caused problems. I bought Jennifer expensive gifts she didn't want, planned elaborate celebrations she didn't attend, and offered help with problems she'd already solved without me. I became a caricature of myself, all generosity and enthusiasm with no authentic core. The more I diminished myself to make room for their marriage, the more invisible I became. It was a vicious cycle that I couldn't break because I didn't even realize I was trapped in it. I thought I was being mature, supportive, selfless. I didn't recognize that I was slowly disappearing. By the time Jennifer called that meeting to tell me I was too loud for her family, I was already a shadow of who I'd once been. She didn't destroy me that Tuesday afternoon. She simply pointed out what I'd allowed to happen to myself over the course of 2 years. But shadows, as I was about to learn, can be very revealing when you finally shine a light on them. The confrontation that changed everything. The 3 weeks following Jennifer's declaration that I was too loud for her family were the longest of my life. I replayed that conversation obsessively, examining every word, every gesture, every moment of silence. I analyzed my own behavior with the intensity of a forensic investigator, trying to understand how I'd become the problem that needed solving. I started keeping a journal during those weeks, documenting every interaction, every feeling, every moment of self-doubt. Reading those entries now, I can see how completely I'd internalized their criticism. "Maybe I am too intense," I wrote on day 5. "Maybe my laugh really is too loud. Maybe I do interrupt people without realizing it." The isolation was suffocating. I'd built my entire adult life around being available for my family, and suddenly I had nowhere to direct that energy. My apartment felt too quiet, my routines felt hollow, and I found myself practicing conversations in the mirror, trying to modulate my voice, to contain my gestures, to become the kind of person who wouldn't make anyone uncomfortable. I threw myself into work with desperate intensity. My elementary school students became the only people around whom I could still be myself. With them, my enthusiasm wasn't excessive. It was exactly what they needed. My loud laugh encouraged their own joy. My animated storytelling captured their attention. My passionate teaching style made music come alive for them. But even at work, I found myself second-guessing every interaction with adult colleagues. When I shared an idea during a faculty meeting, I wondered if my voice was too excited. When I laughed at someone's joke, I worried if my reaction was appropriate. The confidence that had always been my superpower began to crumble under the weight of constant self-monitoring. 2 weeks into my exile, Dad called with news that would test every boundary Jennifer had established. Marcus had been in a car accident, nothing life-threatening, but he was in the hospital overnight with a concussion and some broken ribs. My first instinct was to grab my keys and rush to be by his side. My second thought was Jennifer's voice telling me I was too much, too loud, too uncomfortable to be around her family. I compromised with myself. I'd go to the hospital, but I'd stay quiet, stay in the background, be the kind of sister who didn't cause problems. When I arrived at the emergency room, I found Jennifer in the waiting area. Her perfect composure finally cracked. She looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. "How is he?" I asked, sitting down beside her. "Stable," she said without looking at me. "They're keeping him overnight for observation." We sat in uncomfortable silence for nearly an hour. I wanted to offer comfort, to share stories that would make her smile, to be the emotional support I'd always been for this family. Instead, I sat with my hands folded, my voice barely above a whisper, my natural instincts completely suppressed. When Marcus was finally allowed visitors, I followed Jennifer into his room. He looked pale against the white hospital sheets, but his eyes lit up when he saw me. The first genuine warmth I'd felt from him in months. "Becca," he said, trying to sit up despite his injuries. "I'm so glad you're here. I moved to his bedside, and for a moment it felt like the old days, just the two of us against the world, taking care of each other. I brushed his hair back from his forehead, the same gesture I'd used to comfort him through countless childhood nightmares. "Of course I'm here," I said softly. "Where else would I be?" But even as I spoke, I could feel Jennifer's eyes on me, measuring my words, evaluating my tone, determining whether my presence was acceptable or excessive. The moment that should have been about my brother's well-being became another performance of my worthiness to be there. Over the next few hours, I watched Jennifer interact with the hospital staff, with Marcus, with her own family members who arrived to offer support. She was competent, organized, appropriately concerned. Everything I would have been if I'd allowed myself to respond naturally to the crisis. But she was also cold, distant, going through the motions of caregiving without the emotional investment that transforms duty into love. The revelation came when Jennifer's mother arrived. Patricia Whitman swept into the hospital room like she owned it, immediately taking charge of the situation with the kind of authoritative presence that comes from a lifetime of being listened to without question. "Jennifer, darling, you look exhausted," she said, not acknowledging my presence at all. "Why don't you come home with me tonight? Let the hospital staff handle things here." "I should stay," Jennifer protested, but without much conviction. "Nonsense. There's nothing you can do here that can't wait until morning. Marcus needs rest, not hovering." As I watched this interaction, something clicked into place. This was how Jennifer had learned to navigate relationships, with emotional distance, with practical considerations trumping feelings, with the assumption that love was demonstrated through efficient management rather than messy, complicated presence. But the most telling moment came when Patricia finally acknowledged me. "Rebecca, isn't it? So nice that you could stop by." Stop by. As if I were a casual acquaintance rather than Marcus's sister. As if my presence at my brother's bedside required special permission rather than representing the most natural response to a family crisis. I realized in that moment that I wasn't just dealing with Jennifer's discomfort with my personality. I was confronting two completely different philosophies about family, about love, about what it means to show up for the people who matter to you. The Whitmans saw emotional restraint as maturity, practical distance as appropriate boundaries, measured responses as evidence of stability. My family had always operated from the opposite assumption, that love meant showing up fully, feeling deeply, expressing openly. We were loud because we had things to say. We were intense because we cared intensely. We were too much because the alternative was not being enough. After Patricia and Jennifer left, I stayed with Marcus through the night. We didn't talk much. The painkillers made him drowsy, but for the first time in months I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I held his hand when he dozed, adjusted his blankets, talked quietly with the nurses, and provided the kind of steady, loving presence that had always been my contribution to this family. When he woke up around 3 a.m., confused and in pain, I was there to remind him where he was, to help him sip water, to call the nurse when he needed more medication. When he started to panic about work responsibilities, I was there to calm him down, to assure him that missing a few days wouldn't end his career, to remind him that healing was his only job right now. "I forgot," he said as I was helping him get comfortable again. "Forgot what?" "How you are in a crisis, how you just handle things. Jennifer's great, but she gets overwhelmed when things go wrong. You've always been the one who makes everything okay." Those words should have felt like vindication, but instead they filled me with a sadness so deep I could barely breathe. I'd spent 2 years trying to become smaller, quieter, less myself, and it had taken a crisis to remind my own brother of who I actually was. As the sun rose through the hospital windows, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done apologizing for taking up space. I was done shrinking to accommodate other people's discomfort. I was done pretending that my natural intensity was a character flaw that needed fixing. If Jennifer found me too loud, too much, too uncomfortable to be around, that said more about her limitations than my defects. I wasn't going to disappear to make her more comfortable. I wasn't going to let her rewrite the story of my family to position me as the problem. I was going to reclaim my voice, my place, and my property. Starting now. The moment of clarity. Leaving the hospital that morning felt like emerging from a cave into brilliant sunlight. Everything looked different, sharper, clearer, more real than it had in months. The fog of self-doubt that had been clouding my judgment began to lift, and for the first time since Jennifer's confrontation, I could see the situation for what it really was. I drove straight home, but instead of going to my own apartment, I found myself parked outside the building where Marcus and Jennifer lived. My building, my property, my investment that I'd turned into a gift that had somehow become a weapon used against me. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, staring up at the windows of the apartment I'd furnished with such hope, trying to understand how generosity had been transformed into leverage. The clarity came in waves, each realization building on the last, until I could see the entire pattern of manipulation laid out before me. Jennifer hadn't just been uncomfortable with my personality, she'd been systematically working to eliminate my influence from Marcus's life. Every suggestion for a quieter dinner, every scheduling conflict, every gentle criticism had been part of a larger campaign to reposition me from beloved sister to inconvenient outsider. I thought about the timing of her complaints. They'd never lived rent-free anywhere before moving into my apartment. They'd never had the financial security that came with housing costs eliminated from their budget. They'd never been in a position where they owed someone a debt of gratitude that they couldn't immediately repay. My generosity had created an imbalance of power that Jennifer couldn't tolerate, so she'd worked to reframe it as an imposition rather than a gift. The apartment wasn't just shelter, it was evidence of my importance in Marcus's life, a daily reminder that I had the resources and willingness to support him in ways his wife couldn't match. Every time Jennifer walked through those rooms, she was confronted with proof of my love for her husband, my financial independence, my ability to provide for my family in tangible ways. So she'd set out to make me the problem. If I was too loud, too intense, too uncomfortable to be around, then my contributions became burdens rather than blessings. If I was the family member who didn't fit, then my absence could be framed as consideration rather than rejection. If I was the one who needed to change, then the guilt and shame belonged to me instead of to the people who were systematically excluding me. The genius of her strategy was its subtlety. She'd never directly criticized my generosity. That would have made her look ungrateful. Instead, she'd attacked my character, my personality, my fundamental way of being in the world. She'd convinced Marcus that my love was too intense, my presence too overwhelming, my natural self too much for civilized company. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through 2 years of text messages, looking for patterns I'd been too close to see. There it was, the gradual shift from warm family exchanges to cold logistical communications. The way my invitations had been met with increasing reluctance, then polite deflection, then outright avoidance. The way Marcus had stopped initiating contact, stopped sharing news, stopped treating me like his closest confidant. But I also saw something else in those messages, my own desperate attempts to accommodate, to change, to become whatever version of myself might be acceptable to Jennifer's standards. I'd apologized for things that weren't problems, changed plans that didn't need changing, silenced parts of myself that had brought joy to my family for decades. The most damning evidence was in the gaps, the conversations that had stopped happening, the traditions that had quietly died, the emotional intimacy that had been replaced by polite distance. I'd been so focused on what I was doing wrong that I'd missed what was being systematically taken away from me. My phone rang. Marcus. "Hey," he said, and I could hear the exhaustion in his voice. "I wanted to thank you for last night, for staying with me." "Of course," I said automatically. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Listen, Becca, I've been thinking about some things, about how we've been, about how I've been." There was a long pause and I could practically feel him struggling with words he didn't know how to say. "Can we have coffee sometime this week? Just the two of us? I think we need to talk." It was the first time in months that he'd suggested spending time together without Jennifer's involvement. Something had shifted for him too, some recognition that perhaps the problem wasn't entirely mine to solve. "I'd like that," I said. After we hung up, I made another call to my attorney. If I was going to reclaim my life, I needed to understand exactly what my rights were regarding the apartment. The conversation was illuminating and empowering in equal measure. "The property is titled in your name," Sarah explained. "You're allowing them to live there, but there's no lease agreement, no legal protections for them as tenants. If you want to reclaim the property, you can give them 30 days notice and they'll need to vacate. 30 days. 4 weeks to completely change the power dynamic that had been slowly crushing my sense of self. 4 weeks to stop being the grateful outsider and start being the property owner who'd been taken advantage of. 4 weeks to transform from victim to victor in my own story. "What about improvements they've made?" I asked. "They've painted, made some modifications. Without your written permission, those improvements belong to you. They have no legal claim to compensation for changes made to property they don't own." I thought about the paint colors I'd hated, the modifications I'd never approved, the way they'd treated my property like it was theirs to change without consultation. Suddenly, those small slights felt like larger violations, not just of my preferences, but of my rights as the actual owner. That afternoon, I drove to my real apartment, the small one-bedroom place I'd been living in while they enjoyed the spacious 2-bedroom unit I'd intended as an investment. I looked around at my cramped quarters, at the compromises I'd made to accommodate their needs, at the way I'd diminished my own living situation to improve theirs. For 2 years, I'd been living like the poor relative while they enjoyed the fruits of my financial success. I'd been the one making sacrifices, adapting, settling for less, while they'd been building their dream life in the home I'd provided. The apartment that should have been generating rental income had instead become a symbol of my willingness to put everyone else's needs before my own. I opened my laptop and started researching comparable rental properties in their area. What I found made my blood pressure spike. My apartment, the one they'd been living in rent-free, would easily command $2,800 per month on the open market. Over 2 years, I'd essentially given them nearly $70,000 in free housing. $70,000. That's what my generosity had cost me in actual money, not counting the emotional price I'd paid for their ingratitude. $70,000 that could have gone toward my own mortgage, my own investments, my own future security. Instead, it had been a gift that had somehow transformed me into the problem that needed solving. I pulled up a blank document on my computer and began typing. Notice to vacate. For the first time in months, my hands were steady, my thoughts were clear, and my voice was finding its way back to full volume. I was done being too much for people who were nowhere near enough for me. The meek version of myself that had been apologizing and accommodating and shrinking for 2 years was about to step aside. It was time for the real Rebecca Martinez to reclaim her space, her voice, and her life, and I was going to start with my own apartment. The plan takes shape. The coffee meeting with Marcus took place 3 days later at a small cafe downtown, neutral territory where neither of us would have the advantage of familiar surroundings. I arrived early, partly from nervousness and partly because I wanted to choose a table where I could see his face clearly. 2 years of muted conversations had taught me to read micro-expressions, to look for the truth behind carefully chosen words. He looked older when he walked in, stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before his accident. The confident young man I'd helped raise had been replaced by someone who seemed to be carrying invisible weight. He hugged me, a real hug, not the careful Jennifer-approved version I'd grown accustomed to, and for a moment I felt hopeful. "How are you healing?" I asked after we'd ordered our drinks. "Physically? Fine. Everything else?" He shrugged, a gesture so familiar from his teenage years that it made my chest ache. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since the accident, about priorities, about family, about the person I've become." I waited, letting him find his own words, rather than rushing to fill the silence with my own interpretations. "I know I've been different," he said finally. "I know I've been distant. Marriage changes things, but maybe I've let it change too much." "What do you mean?" He was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee with the kind of focus that meant he was really stirring his thoughts. "Jennifer and I have been having some difficult conversations about expectations, about compromise, about what it means to blend families." I felt a flutter of hope, quickly suppressed. I'd learned not to read too much into Marcus's words, not to assume that recognition of problems meant commitment to solutions. "She's not happy," he continued, "about a lot of things. The apartment, the money situation, the way she feels like she's always competing with our family history." "Competing how?" "You know how you and I have always been close, how we have all those shared experiences, inside jokes, ways of communicating that don't require words." He looked up at me then, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years, the complete attention of someone who genuinely wanted to be understood. "Jennifer feels like she's on the outside of that, like she's married to someone whose most important relationship is with his sister." The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they revealed a truth I'd never considered. In my efforts to maintain my connection with Marcus, had I inadvertently positioned myself as competition for his wife? Had my love for my brother become a threat to his marriage? "Marcus," I said carefully, "I never intended—" "I know," he said quickly. "I know you didn't. But the thing is, Becca, I don't think it matters what you intended. What matters is that my wife feels like she's married to someone who's already taken. We sat with that revelation for several minutes. I thought about all the ways Jennifer had tried to create distance between Marcus and me, all the subtle manipulations I'd attributed to her discomfort with my personality. What if it had been simpler than that? What if she'd just been trying to make room for herself in a relationship that felt impenetrable? "So what do we do?" I asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "Jennifer thinks the solution is for you to step back more. Give us space to build our own family traditions without feeling like we're betraying the old ones." "And what do you think?" "I think," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "I think I've been trying to solve this by making you smaller instead of making our marriage bigger. I think I've been so worried about Jennifer feeling left out that I've been leaving you out instead." It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in 2 years, and it broke something open in my chest. Not broken in a damaging way, but broken like a dam releasing pressure that had been building for too long. "The apartment," I said. "That's part of this, isn't it?" His face flushed, and I knew I'd hit the target. "Jennifer feels like we're charity cases, like we're living off your generosity in a way that makes her feel indebted and resentful at the same time. But I offered," I said. "I wanted to help." "I know. And we needed the help. But needing help from my sister makes Jennifer feel like I can't provide for my own family. And living in your apartment makes her feel like she can never escape the reminder that you're more successful, more established, more everything than we are." The picture was becoming clearer now, and it wasn't the simple story of Jennifer's unreasonable dislike of my personality that I'd been telling myself. It was more complicated, more nuanced, and somehow more heartbreaking because it revealed how 3 people who cared about each other had managed to create a situation where everyone felt hurt and misunderstood. "What if," I said slowly, "what if the apartment wasn't free anymore?" Marcus looked confused. "What do you mean? What if you paid rent, market rate? What if, instead of it being my gift to you, it was a normal landlord-tenant relationship?" "Becca, we can't afford market rate. That's why we needed—" "What if you could?" I pulled out my phone and opened the job search app I'd been browsing earlier that week. "There's a position at Jennifer's company, senior accounting manager. It pays 30% more than what you're making now." His eyes widened as he read the job description. "How did you know about this?" "Because I've been thinking about solutions instead of just problems. Because I've been trying to figure out how to fix this without anyone having to lose." I could see him processing the information, running calculations in his head. With the salary increase, they could afford market rate rent on the apartment. They could transform from charity recipients to legitimate tenants. Jennifer could live in the space without feeling beholden to me, and I could start earning the rental income I'd been forgoing. "But why would you want us to stay?" he asked. "After everything that's happened, after the way Jennifer has treated you, why would you want to keep doing business with us?" It was a fair question, and it deserved an honest answer. "Because you're my brother," I said simply. "Because Jennifer is your wife, which makes her my family too, whether she likes it or not. Because I think the problems between us are solvable if we're all willing to be adults about it." I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. "But Marcus, there are going to be conditions. If you want to rent the apartment from me, it's going to be a real rental agreement with real boundaries. I'm not going to be the accommodating sister who accepts being treated poorly because family. I'm going to be a landlord who expects her tenants to be respectful and responsible." He nodded slowly. "What kind of conditions?" "First, you pay rent on time, every month, no exceptions. Second, any modifications to the property get my written approval first. Third, I'm not your free repair service. If something breaks, you handle it like any other tenant would." I paused, then added the most important condition. And fourth, Jennifer doesn't get to dictate my relationship with you. You're my brother, not just her husband, and I'm not going to disappear to make her more comfortable. Becca, I'm not finished, I said, and something in my tone made him stop talking. I've spent 2 years trying to become the version of myself that Jennifer could tolerate. I've made myself smaller, quieter, less authentic to accommodate her discomfort. That ends now. I pulled the notice to vacate from my purse and set it on the table between us. You have 30 days to decide. Either you take the new job, sign a lease, and we establish adult boundaries that work for everyone, or you find somewhere else to live. Marcus stared at the document like it might catch fire. You're serious. Dead serious. I'm done being taken advantage of. I'm done being treated like my generosity is an imposition. I'm done apologizing for taking up space in my own family. For a long moment, we sat in silence. Then Marcus reached across the table and covered my hand with his. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I'm sorry I let it get this bad. I'm sorry I chose keeping peace over keeping faith with you. I know, I said, but sorry doesn't fix anything unless it comes with changed behavior. He picked up the notice to vacate, folded it carefully, and put it in his pocket. I'll talk to Jennifer tonight about the job, about the rental agreement, about all of it. And Marcus? I waited until he met my eyes again. This isn't negotiable. I'm not offering a middle ground or a compromise position. Either we do this right or we don't do it at all. As I drove home that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of setting boundaries and meaning them. I wasn't trying to punish Marcus or Jennifer. I was trying to save all of us from a dynamic that was slowly poisoning every relationship it touched. The old Rebecca would have offered more time, more flexibility, more chances to get it right. The new Rebecca understood that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for people is refuse to enable their worst behaviors. In 30 days, I'd know whether my family was worth fighting for or whether it was time to build a new life with people who appreciated the real me. Either way, I was done apologizing for being too much for people who weren't nearly enough. Allies and revelations. The week following my ultimatum to Marcos was filled with an unusual kind of peace. For the first time in months, I wasn't walking on eggshells, measuring my words or monitoring my behavior for signs of excessive enthusiasm. I'd drawn clear lines and stated my terms, and now I could simply wait to see which choice they'd make. I used that time productively. I scheduled a professional consultation with a property management company to understand my rights and responsibilities as a landlord. I researched market rates for comparable apartments in the area, drafted a standard lease agreement, and even looked into hiring a property management service if Marcus and Jennifer chose to stay. But I wanted to maintain more distance from the arrangement. The revelation came from an unexpected source. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who lived in the apartment next to Marcus and Jennifer. I'd always liked her. She was a retired teacher with the kind of sharp wit and gentle wisdom that comes from decades of managing teenagers. We'd often chatted when I visited the building, but I hadn't seen her since the awkwardness with Jennifer had begun. I ran into her at the grocery store on Thursday afternoon. She lit up when she saw me, greeting me with the kind of warm enthusiasm that I'd almost forgotten existed. "Rebecca, how wonderful to see you. I was just thinking about you the other day." She paused, studying my face with the intensity of someone who'd spent years reading the emotional states of young people. "You look different, stronger somehow." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen. How are you doing?" "Oh, same as always, though I have to say, it's been quieter in the building lately. I miss hearing your laughter in the hallways." Her words caught me off guard. "My laughter?" "Oh, yes, you have such a wonderful laugh, so full and genuine. It always brightened my day when you'd visit your brother." She shook her head sadly. I haven't heard it in months. I wondered if something had happened. I felt tears prick at my eyes. Here was confirmation that my natural joy hadn't been a burden to everyone, that at least one person had actually missed it when I'd learned to silence it. Mrs. Chen, I said carefully, can I ask you something? Have Marcus and Jennifer seemed happy in the apartment? She looked around conspiratorially, then leaned closer. Between you and me, dear, there's been a lot of tension in that unit. Raised voices, doors slamming. The young woman, Jennifer, she seems very intense, very controlling. Controlling how? Well, I don't like to gossip, but she paused, clearly torn between discretion and concern. I've heard her talking to your brother quite harshly, criticizing his clothes, his friends, his family. She gave me a meaningful look, especially his family. My heart rate picked up. What kinds of things? Oh, I try not to listen, but walls are thin and some conversations are hard to ignore. Things about him being too dependent on his sister, about how he needs to grow up and stop running to family for everything. She seems to think you're, what was the word, enmeshed with him. Enmeshed. It was a therapy term that Jennifer had probably learned from one of her self-help books or perhaps from actual counseling. It referred to relationships where boundaries were unclear, where individual identity got lost in family dynamics. The fact that she was using clinical language to pathologize my relationship with my brother felt like another manipulation, turning normal family closeness into something that sounded unhealthy and inappropriate. Mrs. Chen, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you seen any other concerning behaviors? She hesitated, then seemed to come to a decision. There was one incident that really troubled me. About a month ago, your brother came home from work in a very good mood. He'd gotten some kind of recognition at work and he was excited about it. I could hear him trying to share the news with Jennifer. She paused, shaking her head. That young woman absolutely tore him apart, told him he was being childish, that adults don't get excited about minor workplace achievements, that his enthusiasm was embarrassing. By the time she was finished with him, I could hear him apologizing for being happy about something good that had happened to him. The story hit me like a punch to the gut. Marcus had always been someone who found joy in small victories, who celebrated progress and shared excitement with the people he loved. The idea of him being trained to suppress that natural enthusiasm, to apologize for feeling good about his achievements, was heartbreaking. There's more, Mrs. Chen continued. She monitors his phone calls. I've seen her going through his texts, asking detailed questions about who he's been talking to and what they discussed. And she has very specific rules about when he can have contact with people she doesn't approve of. Rules: no phone calls during their time in the evenings, no spontaneous plans that don't include her, no visiting family without her explicit permission. Chen's voice carried the concern of someone who'd seen troubling patterns before. Rebecca, I taught school for 40 years. I know what emotional manipulation looks like, and that young woman is systematically isolating your brother. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Jennifer's discomfort with my personality had been a symptom, not the disease. The real issue was that she was threatened by any relationship that might compete with her control over Marcus. My closeness with my brother wasn't unhealthy. It was inconvenient for someone who wanted to be his only source of emotional support and guidance. Has he seemed different to you? I asked. Oh, absolutely. When you used to visit regularly, he was so animated, so himself. Now he seems like he's constantly walking on eggshells, monitoring his own behavior, second-guessing every word. She reached out and touched my arm gently. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but he used to light up when you came over. You two had such a natural, easy connection. It was lovely to witness. Had past tense. Even Mrs. Chen could see that something precious had been lost. I should probably go, I said, though I wanted to continue the conversation for hours. But Mrs. Chen, thank you for sharing this with me. It helps me understand some things. Of course, dear. And Rebecca, don't let anyone convince you that your natural warmth is a problem. The world needs more people who love as openly as you do, not fewer. Driving home, I thought about everything Mrs. Chen had shared. The pattern was clear now. Jennifer wasn't just uncomfortable with my presence in their lives, she was systematically working to eliminate any influence that might remind Marcus of who he'd been before she'd begun reshaping him. The apartment arrangement had been particularly threatening because it represented my ability to provide for my brother in ways she couldn't. Every month they lived there, rent-free was a month that demonstrated my financial independence, my generosity, my importance in Marcus's life. No wonder she'd been so eager to reframe my gift as an imposition. But the most troubling revelation was the extent to which Marcus had changed. The brother I'd helped raise had been confident, enthusiastic, quick to laugh and share his joy with others. The man Mrs. Chen described sounded like someone who'd learned to suppress his natural personality to avoid criticism and conflict. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my father and told him everything. Not the sanitized version I'd been sharing to avoid family drama, but the whole truth about Jennifer's behavior, about Marcus's transformation, about the ultimatum I'd given them. Dad listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of understanding or concern. When I finished, there was a long silence. "Mija," he said finally, using the Spanish endearment he'd been calling me since childhood. "Your mother would be proud of you." For what? For finally standing up for yourself. For refusing to disappear to make other people comfortable. His voice was thick with emotion. "I should have said something sooner. I should have protected you from this. Dad, you couldn't have known." "I knew," he interrupted. "I saw what was happening, but I thought it was better to keep the peace, to let you handle it your own way. I was wrong. A father should never let anyone treat his daughter that way, not even family." We talked for another hour, sharing observations and concerns we'd both been keeping to ourselves. Dad had noticed Marcus's changes too. The way he'd become more subdued, more careful with his words, less spontaneous with his affections. He'd attributed it to the normal adjustments of marriage, but now he wondered if something more troubling had been happening. "What do you think they'll choose?" he asked. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I know what I'll choose if they don't step up. I'm done sacrificing my happiness for people who don't appreciate the sacrifice." When I hung up the phone that night, I felt more supported than I had in years. Mrs. Chen's observations had validated my perceptions, and Dad's support had reminded me that I wasn't alone in this fight. If Marcus and Jennifer chose to leave, I'd miss my brother, but I wouldn't miss the person he'd become under Jennifer's influence. In 3 weeks, I'd know whether the Marcus I'd helped raise was still in there somewhere, or whether Jennifer had successfully replaced him with someone who found my love too loud to tolerate.